After 8 on Wednesday, January the 17th, call the Commissioner here on LBC, your opportunity to put your questions to Sir Mark Rowley, who is the Met Commissioner and, of course, is in the seat opposite me now. But just before I come to your calls, I want to start by saying thank you. Thanks to you and your team for allowing one of my colleagues to come out on one of your operations last night, which specifically, and we've actually played the report out already if you've not heard it, Sir Mark.
Yeah.
But there's been some very powerful footage on some of the TV news stations. There's very powerful pictures in some of the newspapers today, The Times and The Guardian. This is undercover police officers catching 27 luxury watch thieves with a special operation in central London. If listeners haven't heard already, what are they doing and how successful has it been? And morning to you, Mark.
It's been good morning, Nick. It's been fantastically successful. I think it goes to our collective determination, but also the bravery of some of our officers. So basically, it's officers going out undercover with expensive watches on their wrists, going to the areas that we know offenders are targeting. So these officers are going out to be robbed by violent criminals. Just think about that for a moment. You've got to have some real guts to be prepared to do that. Clearly, we've got the cavalry round the corner for when the robbery happens.
Yes.
But you can't intervene until the robbery starts to take place. I was giving a commissioner's commendation to one of the officers involved a few months ago, and he was telling me that how much he enjoyed the operations. I think he's obviously got a screw loose, but he's actually saying, as he was being robbed and he was being manhandled, it was getting quite violent. He said he actually started laughing because he knew what was about to land on all the other people around him.
It was necessary because of 300 watches worth £4 million. Obviously, I don't expect you to share close policing details, but this operation will return at some point.
Yeah, we will keep doing these operations to deal with this, to deal with some of the phone snatches that are going on in London. Criminals need to be afraid that they're going to get caught, and this is about creating some of that surprise factor for them, different tactics that keep them on their toes. And on this operation, I think as you see in the report, it immediately dropped the robberies by 30% because all of a sudden we did a few of these operations over a few weeks. The word got round and they pulled back.
Is it solely men who go undercover?
No, we do it with women as well. I mean, the high value watch robberies tends to be men, but we do similar operations with women. I was at the same commendation service. I was giving commendations to young women officers who were going out using a similar tactic for a sexual predator, an identified sexual predator who sort of.
How does that work? Again, do they go to Intel-led hotspots outside bars?
Hotspots. Well, this was based on a particular offender that we knew was recruiting certain areas. So it was to build evidence against a particular person. But I mean, again, the bravery of these young men and women are extraordinary. And it's one of the things. My job, I tend to get the best and the worst of the organisation. This is the best, and commending people like this. That's fantastic what they're doing.
Just for my listener, I'm going to address you. Come on, Governor. What would you say about blokes who knowingly put them? I know the cavalry's around the corner. I get that. They knowingly put themselves in harm's way with people who could be carrying knives. Women who knowingly put themselves potentially at risk of sexual predators. What do you say about this bravery?
They're phenomenal. They're just absolutely amazing. So that's the highest award I can give is a Commissioner's Commendation, and that's why I was doing that only a few months ago. And it was out of sitting down with them that made me think we need to be telling the world about this, and that's where this report comes from.
As a younger man, would you have done this as a copper?
I'd love to have done it.
Why?
I wouldn't have told my wife, though, because she'd have been cross.
You would have done it?
I would, yeah, it'd be great, yeah.
OK, last couple of questions.
I said to the team that sort of if they need someone older as a target, then I'd be happy to do it. But they said they're not allowed to deploy the Commissioner like that. It's not really a good idea, which I understand. But
not even on his day off?
No, not even his day off, apparently.
Right. Where do you get the Rolexes and the Patek Philippe watches?
I think most of them are seized from criminals, so they're sort of seized property. So we've had them off. I know gang members, drug dealers, etc., who've got them.
So you don't go out and buy them?
No. I think occasionally for something high value, we might have a friendly store that helps us out, but usually it's stolen property that we're repurposing.
And before we move on the electric bike aspect, the officers that my colleagues were with yesterday, very hard-working, racing around town, doing everything they could. But they did point to the fact that it's very difficult. Three thieves in Oxford Street who stole, we believe, 6 phones, got away because they were on e-bikes, not rental ones, on these electric bikes. And you'll know as well, I'm sure you've been out with your men and women, what are we to do about this in a built-up area such as London? It's such an easy form of escape, Commissioner.
It's very difficult. And sort of they buy certain types of e-bikes, which they then delimit. So e-bikes, to be legal, are limited to speed, I think it's 25 or 30 miles an hour. But some of them, it's quite easy to delimit them. And they'll get up to like 50 or 60 miles an hour. And they're sort of tearing down alleyways, escaping, and you can't do a pursuit in that context. We do have certain tactics to sort of nudge people off bikes with cars, etc.
But if you're down a narrow alleyway, I can't get my car down. But you can't
do that. They are quite dangerous, difficult tactics, and officers are very cautious about using them, and they do sometimes fear they're going to be investigated for using those tactics, even though that's what we train them in and that's what we need them to do. So it is very difficult. We seize the bikes regularly. So whenever we see these bikes, we seize them. We have lots of them that we've impounded because they're delimited, they become illegal. So if we can get hold of one, then if you don't have insurance, it's a motorbike effectively, so we can take it off the road. So we're doing all of that, but once they're out and about, it's very difficult. And these are teenage kids. I was out at Lambeth and Southwark yesterday with the local BCU commander, who's a really impressive guy, and I've sat with him through his performance and tasking meetings with his team, which is how they drive activity, and they've been dealing with some of the robbery issues around London Bridge and Waterloo stations, and they've got these sort of problems that they're dealing with. And one of the things they're finding is it's the same kids they're arresting again and again, because these tend to be like 40, 50, 60, 70 year olds
standing by.
No, but they're arresting the same kids again and again and again. But the courts don't remand kids in custody. Kids aren't kept. So the same offenders are coming back to the system again and again and again, which is really, really challenging. But they're on it.
Right, it's called the Commissioner. Enough time from me. Let's go to Xavier, who's in Deptford, and you're through to the Commissioner. Xavier, go ahead with your question. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, Commissioner. I wanted to press on drug-related crime issues, as there's a significant link between this and knife crime. So I want to know, what can you promise about your investigative efforts in drug-related crime?
Xavier, that's a great question. The link between drugs and violence is very strong. A lot of London street gangs are involved in the drugs trade. The team have been targeting the highest harm gangs in London over the last year, and I was talking to one of my senior team who's dealing with that only earlier this morning, and he was telling me that sort of we've reduced the number of high harm gangs on the streets by 20% by targeting the most dangerous and putting them in prison. One tactic we've been using and continue to do is we do the county lines and city lines work. So the people running the phone lines that get the drugs off, the people behind that are men of violence. Over 80% of the people we're arresting running those drugs lines have previous convictions for serious violence. I think it's 1 in 3 of them have got serious assaults in their background. So this isn't a harmless drugs trade. It's linked to violence, as you suggest. And using those tactics, we're putting a lot of them in prison. And that's holding our violence rates at well below the rates they were before COVID. Obviously, COVID created a completely different landscape where crime fell to the floor. It's bounced back, but we're keeping it well below the pre-COVID levels.
How is violence to be tackled just before Christmas, Commissioner? I understand someone was robbed of his Canada Goose jacket down in Chislehurst. So it's not just luxury watches and mobile phones, Commissioner. It's now expensive jackets and I understand even expensive shoes or trainers.
Yeah, so people will go out and sort of rob anything they see value in. And the most common thing is phones. So we will do the sort of brave operations that you've seen there to target offenders. And we're always looking as well at what can be done to prevent these offences. And so myself and the Mayor have been putting pressure on the phone industry, because it shouldn't be possible to steal your £1,000 phone, Nick, and then re-register it and someone else use it. It should be dead once it's been stolen. And at the moment, the phone company's software isn't good enough to do that, and it ought to be.
All right. There was an attack, you might be aware, on Friday of an A-level student in Bishop's Park in Fulham, just as school closed. Our park's a hotspot now, Commissioner.
So there isn't a sort of, you can't just say parks are hotspots or whatever. There's different areas. Often we find it in crowded spaces. Usually we found around stations. The West End is an area we do a lot of operations. I think that's where your guys were at last night with my team. So we're always targeting the hotspot areas.
All right, okay. Xavier, thank you. Alicia is in Haringey. Your question to the Commissioner. Morning to you.
Good morning. As the Met Police themselves have reported, there's been a 1,300% increase in anti-Semitism across London in recent months. As a Jewish mother, London has become a no-go zone every weekend with the protests and hate marches that are filling our streets, which I believe are very much setting the tone for how London feels. I'm wondering what the police are doing to make London feel accessible and safe for Londoners and for Jews and the general population across London.
Sir Mark.
Alicia, thank you. I absolutely understand how, given the surge in hate crime, how communities feel more anxious, more upset, more fearful. So, yeah, as you say, it's over tenfold the increase in anti-Semitic hatred over the last 3 months. It's sort of 2 or 3-fold anti-Muslim hatred. The figures I've seen recently show that the number of anti-Semitic crimes is double the number of anti-Muslim crimes, and of course, Jewish population in London is much smaller than the Muslim population. So that the intensity of that is very obvious
grave
to anybody and very grave and has that effect. In terms of the protests, we're determined to do everything we can do within the law that creates the frameworks around protest to make sure that we balance the rights of protesters with not having the centre of London as a place that people such as yourself are afraid to come into.
Do you think your men and women are being robust enough, Commissioner?
I think we are.
Go ahead. There are reports that, of course, there are people who've been carrying offensive banners, people who go with balaclavas, people who even chant the "From the river to the sea," and your men and women just watch.
That's not true. We've been arresting people, anybody who's committing offences, wherever possible, we've arrested them on the day. Even when they've been in the middle of crowds, we've been doing sort of interception tactics where you go into the middle of a crowd and take them out, which is very difficult. And where we don't spot it on the day, bear in mind if you've got 50 or 100,000 people and someone puts a bandana on for a couple of minutes for a photo and puts it away, you might not spot them. We follow it up with appeals and we make arrests. The thing that is really disturbing about these protests is even though you've got tens of thousands of people who are behaving sensibly, we have tens of people who are hate crime posters, terrorist supporting posters, and it's completely unacceptable. And every one of these protests, we're arresting tens of people for that. At the end of the march, we've put strict conditions on because we have seen some of the earlier ones where groups of young men then go sort of in large numbers through sort of Covent Garden, Leicester Square and those sorts of areas, which again sort of creates a sense of fear. So we've been very clear on the dispersal to make sure that doesn't happen. So we're trying to manage it as tightly as we can do. What's
the cost been in terms of personnel and financial cost, Commissioner?
So the cost is now north of £20 million. We are tens of thousands of officer shifts have been put on this. This is stripping resources out of policing local communities into doing this in the centre of London.
So is there vulnerability for people living out in Sidcup and up in wherever else it may be, Highgate, that you've got to move your blokes and women into the centre of London? There's a vulnerability because police officers can't be in two places at once.
I think using a word like vulnerability suggests there's nothing left in Sidcup. That's not the case. But you will have listeners, and someone might raise it, that's saying, actually, my community police officer has been around less recently because he or she's been dragged into London a few times. So there are cases like that. It doesn't leave the community completely vulnerable, but it's not ideal.
Do you think some of the protest groups should be involved in paying some of the funding for this?
I saw a report on that. And I think that's a very sensitive matter, isn't it? Saying for freedom of speech, people have to pay for it. I think that's a matter for government and Parliament, not
it was Lord Walner's suggestion.
I saw that. Yeah. I would make a different point. Last year, 2023, policing football in London cost us £18.5 million that the Premier League don't pay for. I think that's if you wanted to help the police out with people paying for the policing they draw out of communities, that would be a much more powerful example.
So Arsenal and Chelsea don't pay for your blokes and women?
No. There's a very narrow legal framework which says they only pay for the officers who go into the ground. So all of those officers managing stuff around the ground.
Okay, so the ones in the Emirates, but all the men and women outside on horses.
Which is very few. So all the ones outside on horses, all dealing with disorder before and afterwards around train stations, etc. £18.5 million last year, not paid for.
All right, Alicia, thank you. Let's go to Nick in Barnstaple. Your question to the Commissioner. Go ahead, Nick. Morning.
Morning. Hello, Commissioner.
Hi there.
My question is, as the Post Office officials wrongly made the sub-postmasters hand over thousands of pounds for shortfalls with the tills, do you think those officials who made that decision be charged themselves with theft or fraud? Because basically they stolen money and they didn't hand it back.
Nick, thank you. It's a ghastly story, isn't it? And I've been following it for some time because the Met has had a limited investigation referred to a couple of years ago. We're now working with police forces across the country to pull together what will have to be a national investigation, which will pull together because, as you know, there's hundreds of postmasters and mistresses from across the country. Fujitsu are based in one part of the country, the post office lawyers in another part of the country. Massive piece of work to do. There are tens of millions of documents to be worked through in a criminal investigation. And, of course, we've got to do that following on behind the public inquiry, which I think finishes at the end of this year but won't publish till late next year. So this is going to be a big detective team, probably many tens of officers doing that. And my lead on that, Assistant Commissioner Louisa Rolfe, is working with chiefs across the country to sort of build that national framework to
What
see...
would constitute a crime in this area, Commissioner? What would your men and women be looking for?
I think at the core of this, you've potentially got fraud in terms of false documents if it's for financial purposes, and you've potentially got perverting the course of justice because you're sort of, if people have deliberately set in train evidence into a legal process which they know is false, that would be perverting the course of justice. To prove this to a criminal standard is different to what's in a documentary, etc. Clearly, we have to prove beyond all reasonable doubt, so really to 99.999%, that individuals knowingly corrupted something. So that's going way beyond incompetence. You have to prove deliberate malice, and so that has to be done very thoroughly with an exhaustive investigation. So it won't be quick, but the police service across the country is alive to this, and we will do everything we can do to bring people to justice if criminal offences can be proven.
You know what my final question on this is going to be, Commissioner. Do you have a timeline for this, when this might be, that if charges are to be brought, or when you would wrap up that particular team?
It's almost certainly going to be well after the end of the public inquiry, and the public inquiry doesn't publish till late next year.
So we're looking possibly at 26?
At least, yes.
At least 26
yeah.
before we get
and
into
we've
that.
got so the initial investigative steps that we've been taking in the Met since an early referral on a narrow part of this a couple of years ago. We've got tens of millions of documents ingested into our system. It gives a sense of the scale you have to work through. It's not a straightforward case.
All right. Taking you back in time to when you were a very young man, you probably weren't even Chief Constable of Surrey at this time. You were probably just starting your career when the case of Muriel Mackay broke. And we spoke on the show last week with Mark Dyer, the grandson. Hopefully your team have made you aware of this.
Yeah.
Muriel Mackay was murdered in 1970. The body has never been found. He wants the Met to grant a search warrant for the farm where he believes the body of his grandmother is buried. Commissioner, he sent in this brief question.
So, Mark, I'd like to ask you if I could collect my grandmother from Stocking Farm at Stocking Pelham. I've been asking your senior investigating officers to do so now for a year, and they have been prevaricating, even though compelling evidence, affidavits from a lifer and video evidence from a lifer. Please, could you instruct them immediately to let me dig up my grandmother?
Commissioner?
The case it's really tragic, isn't it? You have two men convicted of kidnapping and murder, I think best part of 50 years ago. And whilst justice was done in that way, Muriel Mackay's body was never...
Family seek closure, Commissioner.
Muriel Mackay's body was never found. And for her loved ones and her family, clearly that is obviously massively upsetting. We would love to bring closure and do that. We have already done a search at the location, quite an extensive search in the last couple of years. The information is, as the questioner hints, is coming from one of the people who were convicted. It's not entirely consistent. It keeps changing. If and when we get concrete evidence, we will be prepared to go back there. So we need to be able to get a warrant to go to the existing landowners and say, we've got a warrant to search on this basis.
But if you thought Lord Lucan was buried in my back garden, or Shergar, your blokes and women are going to arrive. They're just going to start digging up my patio.
If we've got firm, consistent evidence, if I take it away from this case, we've had cases with other murderers in prison who then try to get attention, and by telling stories and being inconsistent in what they say, and they run rings around people. We've already done a search, a limited search, but a search at the premises based on what we were told previously. If we can narrow down to be sufficiently concrete about where we need to look, then we will get a warrant and we will do it. So
how is that to be brought about? Do you need to speak to the convicted person?
So we've been doing that work, and my team are doing assessments and seeing if we can build a case to do the warrant. So we haven't ruled it out. We are trying to get there, but we need to do it as far as the law allows. We can't just go crashing into somebody's premises if we haven't got the grounds to do it, and that's what we're working our way through. I'm giving a sort of process answer based on the law. Here you've got a family who are upset because they want closure, because they want their loved one returned to them so as you can be buried with dignity. I would love to achieve that, but I've just got to work through this process to achieve that. So
you are doing as much as you and your teams are doing as much as you humanly can. All right, okay, thank you for that. Let's go to other calls. Daniel is in Hackney. Daniel, you're through to the Commissioner. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Daniel.
Good morning, Commissioner. So just quickly, so I've got a friend whose house was recently broken into while she was inside the house. And after going to the police, she has essentially been told afterwards that they have more important things to be dealing with first. So my question is, why aren't house robberies important in the Met?
Ooh, I think you might get a robust response.
So they are important. They are absolutely important. If you can share your details with the production team,
there will be.
Without going to the details of your case, if we've slipped up and not done as much as we should do, I will correct that. So please, let's have your details. What you should expect on if your house is broken into, you should expect an officer to attend. We do in the vast majority of cases to look at it. If there's any chance of forensics being useful, you should expect a scenes of crime officer to come, and we'll follow up all the reasonable leads we can do. We can't solve every case, but we'll follow up and do what we can do.
Daniel, stay on the line. One of my team will talk to you. It'll probably be later this week, but I do know from past experience the Commissioner will action something, so something will take place. Can I just take you back briefly before we go to Margaret? You'll be the next caller. Back to the demonstrations that you and your colleagues have had to police. We now know, of course, I think this week it was announced that Hizb ut-Tahrir has been designated as a prescribed organisation. What will that mean to the dynamic of future policing of these demos?
So Hizb ut-Tahrir did a couple of demonstrations early on. They weren't part of the main big demonstrations. The main ones they did were they did some demonstrations between the Turkish and the Egyptian embassies, and they made some statements outside. They've been a group of concern as a radicalising group for many, many years. They're banned in several other countries. Over the last 10 or 15 years, they've been looked at several times a year, and the Home Secretaries of the day haven't felt there was enough evidence to justify banning them. They're now banned under terrorism law. What that means is they can no longer exist as a group. They can't. So not just protesting. You can't be a member of that group. Anybody supporting that group would be seen to be supporting a terrorist organisation. So it's very, very draconian, the terrorism legislation. So that group needs to dissolve immediately, and people not behave as if they're part of it or support it, because they'll be arrested if they do.
Another group, not banned, I stress, Friends of Al-Aqsa. There was a rally on the weekend after the Houthi rebel action and the bombing in Yemen. And Mohammed El-Kurd is reported to say, "Our day will come, but we must not be complacent. Our day will come, but we must normalise massacres as the status quo," referencing the tragic events in Israel of October the 7th. What action will follow that?
He's going to be interviewed under caution, and we'll look at whether there's an evidence to prosecute. He's also then gone on social media to say, English isn't my first language, I misspoke my script, there was supposed to be a not in there. That may or may not be true, but we don't do debate by social media. We interview people who say things like that under caution, and we work out whether we can prosecute them.
OK. I remind my listeners, prior to being the Commissioner, one brief you held was Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations at the Met, effectively
the counter-terrorism
counter-terror
work,
brief.
yeah,
The
absolutely.
counter-terror brief. So with events in Israel, Gaza, Yemen, the Houthi rebels, do we have concerns for security levels here in the UK, Commissioner?
We absolutely do. So the first thing I should say is the national threat level hasn't risen. So it's at the sort of severe is the level which is the highest it tends to be at for a long time, but it's a level below that, substantial. So an attack is likely, but it's not highly likely or imminent or anything like that. What we are seeing, though, we're seeing an increased numbers of referrals into Prevent. We're seeing more intelligence leads suggesting people being radicalised and thinking about terrorism. The number of online investigations that the counter-terrorism teams has gone up. There's several hundred have come in over recent months, where there's sort of potentially terrorist propaganda and things going on online that are of concern and potentially linked to the UK. So we are seeing an effect of this. It hasn't justified yet a rising of the threat level, but we are concerned about it. And those teams are dealing with both that, and also a big part of their work is the threat from hostile states, which we've spoken about in the past as well, which links into this because of countries like Iran.
again, without asking you to give away key intelligence, and I know you wouldn't anyway, what would constitute the need to lift the level of threat up? What would it take?
So if JTAC, which is the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, if they independently came to the view that all the intelligence from all the investigations we're doing with MI5 and others, if there's an increased level of activity, increased likelihood of attack, that would be what it would be. So it'd be about a volume and a sort of imminence of thinking. At the moment, that hasn't been necessary.
All right. And just before we move on to Margaret, again with this, it's reported that the Scotland Yard War Crime Unit has met with a pro-Palestinian campaign group to hear allegations of offences committed by Israel in Gaza. Noting that we have horrific crimes in places such as Hackney and Chislehurst, why is the Met worrying about crimes in Gaza?
So I'm really glad you brought this up, Nick, because there's been a lot of sort of reporting on the war crimes issue over the last week or so, most of it mistaken. So our counter-terrorism resources that we've just been talking about, for every £100, £99.70 is spent dealing with terrorism and hostile state threats. 30p is spent on war crimes. So let's keep this in proportion. The main activity that they're doing, and there are some cases in advanced stages linking to, for example, the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s, is to make sure people involved in genocide who've ended up in this country don't have safe harbour here and are prosecuted. We have a legal duty to have a war crimes team in the UK because of the Treaty of Rome, which was signed by the UK government in the 1990s, I think, and that's the proper function of this. And we, as part of that treaty, we have to link into the International Criminal Court. Anybody can come to us and make an allegation of crime. We won't investigate it if there's nothing credible in it. So just as you could make an allegation to the police tomorrow that there was completely false, we would look at it and say there's nothing here that justifies investigation. So people coming to give us material doesn't mean there's going to be an investigation. We will look at it objectively. It
says the police have been given names of 12 British citizens who've gone to Israel and joined the IDF. They could, of course, be dual nationals.
Exactly. So that's not a crime. So somebody's come and told us some stuff. That doesn't imply we're going to do a criminal investigation.
And given the pressure on the Met, and you know it far better than I, and I hear 30p of every £100, it's still tying up blokes and women, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's also dealing with people who've committed potentially genocide in an African country and have sought safe haven here.
And you'd hear it both ways. You would hear if people had information on Palestinians who might be operatives for Hamas, just as you would hear people
exactly,
who might be
and that'd be a terrorist investigation. I mean, if anybody has information, for example, on people who've been supporting or were part of or funded or anything, the Hamas attack on Israelis that led to over 1,000 people being killed and brutalised, then of course we'll deal with that.
Last question for now, I think. Margaret in Edmonton, sorry for keeping you. You're through to the Commissioner. Go ahead. Morning.
Okay, good morning, Nick.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
And thanks for taking my call and question. So my question is this, really. Why is the Met still in special measures, and what is happening with regards to the time frame to bring you guys out of that?
That's a very well informed question. So, as various scandals broke in sort of 21 and 22, the Inspectorate of Constabularies in June 22 said the Met needs to be put in special measures for a whole range of reasons. Many of those we've now dealt with, and we're making good progress. And we had the last meeting with the HMIs, the Her Majesty Inspectors, last week. So some of the progress we've made, for example. The Met hadn't hit our 999 call handling target since 2016. So if you phone 999, you want the phone answered very quickly because probably something horrible is happening.
Do you have a time?
Targets within 10 seconds.
Right, okay.
2 years, 18 months ago, it was bouncing around about 60% of the time we were successful. Now, most days it's bouncing between about 85 and 95%, and so the target is 90%. So we're getting to the right area. So that's one example. Another example, there were challenges on the back of the Daniel Morgan public inquiry about how we were handling exhibits and the integrity of evidence. We've put in place new systems and processes on that. So we're making all the progress that we need to. But there are many deep issues, and you'll sort of see that we produced our plan, which is about reforming the Met, called New Met for London, which was published last spring.
Yes.
And as part of that, we're having sort of budget conversations on the progress we're making and what needs to come next with the Mayor and the Home Secretary.
Well, it's interesting you say budget conversations. The Conservatives on the London Assembly have said, London Mayor Sadiq Khan is refusing to give you, the Met, £70 million. Can you comment? Is that true?
So I'm having conversations with the Mayor and the Home Secretary about our plan and the budget that required. The best way to do negotiations with them is not to shout about them on your programme.
OK. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Ongoing conversation.
One of the other challenges you had is that you had what were called some rogue officers. Operation Onyx was launched into that, identifying 700 previously completed cases where there would be new or missed lines of inquiry. How many of those 700 have been moved as a result?
So we are removing officers from the Met faster than ever before. We've got a large number of misconduct cases coming this year. So our rates of exit have gone up and are increasing to go up. And there's two separate issues here that I want to stress. I've got hundreds of officers, because of legacy issues, who shouldn't be in the Met, who've treated women and others disgracefully, and we're working our way through that, and they're leaving the organisation either because they're failing vetting or because they're going out on misconduct hearings. At the same time, I've got tens of thousands of brilliant officers. We started the programme with some of them who are doing extraordinary things, bravery in terms of undercover operations, and those tens of thousands of officers need my and our support, because day in and day out they go out there and they need to know the public support them as much as they want us to sort out the minority who let them down.
So how do you ensure officer accountability, Commissioner?
So how do I ensure?
How does the Met ensure?
So we ensure it. So we've got better integrity systems. We've put in sort of new monitoring systems for our officers. We've got hotlines to take more reports. So all the misconduct is being drawn out of the system. Meanwhile, we need to make sure the accountability of our best officers is fair. So they're dealing with difficult, risky, complicated issues. And I'm concerned that sometimes they're not held to a fair standard. There was a case I spoke about publicly just a few weeks ago, Nick. I don't know if you saw it. Yeah. There was a PC Fisher who was outrageously taken to a Crown Court trial for dangerous driving. He was driving to a terrorist attack. He's a firearms officer. He was driving to a terrorist attack, which was in progress to save people's lives. And I've watched the video. He definitely went faster than he should have done, even on blue lights, and he made a mistake. So under the most immense pressure, he made a mistake. Clearly, there's some training and learning issues. For him to have that hanging over him, for him and his family for 4 years, and to go on trial for dangerous driving at Crown Court for driving at speed to a terrorist attack is disgraceful. Of course, the jury acquitted him in no time at all.
Yes, this was at Southwark Crown Court. PC Paul Fisher cleared of dangerous driving.
Exactly. And so those sorts of cases. So we have to be careful that in our vigour to take on the officers who have been abusing women doing disgraceful things, we don't undermine the fantastic officers doing extraordinary things like the cases we've spoken about today.
Final question. I think it's fair to say the whole country has been rocked by horrific revelations of the inquiry into events what went on in Rochdale involving the Greater Manchester Police. Do you imagine there are grooming gangs operating in London?
So I think the risk of children and young people being groomed for sexual exploitation or criminal purposes is really high. All of our gang work, we look at that and we try to identify children who are vulnerable. It's really difficult sort of sifting for the dangerous from the vulnerable in these cases. And sort of HMI have been looking at that with us, and they've made some recommendations, some areas we can improve in that as well. But it is really critical to get underneath it. But it's so difficult when you've got young people, say, involved in drugs gangs, working out, is this 15-year-old sort of a dangerous offender and they're carrying weapons, etc., or actually is it more they've been bullied and coerced into that and are a victim? And sifting that, sort of sifting the wheat from the chaff in that is very difficult. But that's the job, and we need to do better at it.
But noting it was on a different Chief Constable's watch, you must have been disappointed by how GMP performed in some ways.
It's not for me to comment on something in GMP.
All right. So, Mark Rowley, thank you for your time.
Nick, and thanks for sort of broadcasting the stuff about my heroic officers. They did an amazing job.
That's an extraordinary story, particularly knowing they're going to come into harm's way. Some guy with a knife, somebody trying to sexually attack a woman.
Yeah.
And these men and women, how difficult is it to encourage them to do it? Or they just step forward. It's just what they sign up to do.
They love it. When I was giving them the commissioner's commendations, I couldn't get over how much they enjoyed it. They're just great people. They really care, and they just want to make the streets of London safer, and they love the way they can contribute.
Well, thank God they're on our side, eh?
Here.
So
Take care, Nick.
Thank you for being on LBC 8:35 Headlines.
The head of the Met Police has told Nick that criminals will be kept on their toes by operations to tackle phone and watch robberies. So Mark Rowley says undercover officers are acting with real guts to go out and be robbed by violent criminals. Official figures show there was an unexpected rise in inflation last month. Consumer prices increased by 4% in the year to December, up from 3.9% in November. The illegal migration minister has told Nick there is united determination among Conservative MPs to get behind the Rwanda plan. The government's working to avoid a rebellion by Tories who want to see the bill strengthened. LBC weather, another cold and frosty day for most places. Snow in parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland, a high of 5 Celsius.
LBC.
Hello.
Reflect on what we've heard from leading political figures, or, of course, in this case, the Commissioner of the Met, the nation's number one police officer, taking your calls. First time so far this year. LBC's reporter Henry Riley in the studio with me now. Let's pick up on